Hello. Greetings, everyone. I'm the Reverend Jill Olds, the director of the Youth Ministry Institute at Yale Divinity School. The YMI is very pleased to welcome all of you to today's webinar entitled The Science of Well-Being. I see some familiar faces and names among our group today. Welcome back to those of you who have joined us before, and a special welcome to all of you who are joining our community for the first time. We're glad to have you. For our time today, Dr. Santos will speak to us shortly, after which there will be some time for questions. You will remain muted throughout the entire session, but we will be monitoring the chat window. So if you have a question, please feel free to type it in there. Our office has a great staff, and I'd like to introduce them very quickly, just so you can put some faces to the names of folks who are helping to make our time go smoothly. Our office, the YMI, is under the purview of the Center of Continuing Education at YDS. So we have Kelly Morrissey, the managing director, and we have Megan Lukens, who is our communications coordinator. Thank you to you both for your hard work on this and on all of our events. If you're new to the Youth Ministry Institute, we invite you to peruse our website when you get a free chance. That's yaleyouthministryinstitute.org. You can see that in the chat window. We have a whole array of resources on there, folks. We have curricula for your youth, training modules for youth leaders, discussion forums. We have over 700 video clips and lectures given by the world's leading youth ministry experts. We have COVID era resources. We have a lot about mental health for youth. We have tips for resilience with youth. We have resources for anti-racism work with your youth. We have links to other resources. We have a whole array of great things on there, and all of that is available for free. So please do check us out when you get a chance. We also would like you to mark your calendars for our upcoming events. Many of you may know by now that our theme for this year is Not Your Mother's Youth Group, Ministry to Youth in 2020 and 2021. We chose this theme because while we often talk about living in unprecedented times, 2020 has been like no other in this regard. So in response to this very unique season, we are tasked with doing some pretty unique ministry, and we're here to help with that. In addition to today's very timely attention to how our youth and we adults experience happiness, our upcoming offerings will focus on how to build up student leadership through mission work and outdoor ministry, even in the midst of a pandemic. Our next offering is Wednesday, December 2nd at 12 p.m., at which time we will welcome the Reverend Andrew Wicks and the Reverend Ryan Gackenheimer. And they both have worked on outdoor ministry opportunities for youth and on creating virtual mission trips in this COVID time. And those were enjoyed this past summer by many groups local to Connecticut and beyond, and we suspect may be very applicable to the coming months as well. So please do consider joining us then. That's Wednesday, December 2nd at noon. A link to that registration can be found on our website, in our email newsletter, and in our chat. And finally, I'd like to take a moment for us to address something else here. Yesterday, we witnessed a presidential election, the gravity of which, like what we said about 2020, has felt entirely unprecedented. And in the absence of a clear outcome today, emotions and anxiety are still running very high for many of us. So I'd like for us to take 1 minute of silence to rest. If you are from a praying or meditating tradition, pray or meditate. Whatever tradition we come from, all of us need breath. Indeed, breath is life. And there has been so much churn lately that deep breaths can sometimes feel like a luxury rather than a necessity. We also know and talked about last month in our last webinar how breath has literally been taken away from certain subsets of our population. So we wanted to give you just a minute today to breathe, to sit, to feel. I'm going to ring a chime to bring us into that space, and after 1 minute, I will ring the same chime to bring us out of that space. And now, friends, let us take a minute to breathe. I pray that more such moments come your way in the coming days. At this time, it is my great pleasure to introduce all of you to Dr. Laurie Santos. Dr. Santos is a cognitive scientist and a professor of psychology at Yale University. She is also the director of Yale's Comparative Cognition Laboratory, director of Yale's Canine Cognition Lab, and head of Yale Silliman College. She has been a featured TED Talk speaker and has been listed in Popular Science as one of their quote unquote brilliant 10 young scientists, as well as in Time magazine as a leading campus celebrity. In January of 2018, her course entitled Psychology and the Good Life became the most popular course in all of Yale's history, with approximately 1/4 of Yale's undergraduates enrolled. In September of 2019, she became the host of the podcast, The Happiness Lab. Most recently, she has tailored her findings regarding science and happiness with youth and young people. She has tailored her findings to youth and young people in particular, excuse me, a result much sought after by various school districts. And incidentally, those of us who lead students in our varied contexts of ministry can appreciate how important happiness is for youth and youth ministry. Dr. Santos, thank you so much for being here. We are beyond honored to have you.
Thanks so much for having me, and thanks so much for bringing me in to talk about happiness in such a tricky time. I think, many of us are kind of, again, as you mentioned, Jill, kind of feeling uncertain and a little anxious this morning in a way we might not have been expecting. And so hopefully the kinds of things we'll talk about today can bring you some calm and some evidence-based strategies that you can use to feel better, and ones that you can share with your students too. And so I'm going to try to switch over to my PowerPoint here. We'll hope that, the folks at Zoom are kind of working with us. But yeah, so today I was going to sort of introduce you to these sort of tips that you can use to improve your happiness during COVID. These are going to be things that you can use yourself to improve your own well-being, but also things that you can share with the youth that you're working with. And I think it's really important to realize that focusing on your happiness and your self-care is critical during this. One thing we know is that you need to put your oxygen mask on first other people. I think that's never been more true. And this will be a whole lecture sort of for you to think about how you can put that oxygen mask on. And so with that, I kind of wanted to provide a little bit of an introduction. You heard a little bit about how I got into this work, but I think hearing the story is important. And so as mentioned, I am a professor of, oops, let me get the slides going here. I'm a professor at this here at Yale. I've been teaching there for over a decade, but in just the last couple years, I took on a new role at Yale. I became one of their heads of college. And this was my moment to start working with students in a lot of detail. In this role as head of college, I live with students on campus. My house is in the middle of this quad here. That means I see students in the trenches. I see them in the dining hall. I see them, in the coffee shop. And I honestly didn't like what I was seeing. I was seeing this so-called college student mental health crisis up close and personal. And I think this is really important to kind of walk through. I mean, you all work with youth, so maybe I'm sort of preaching to the choir a little bit here, but a lot of the people I talk to kind of don't realize the stresses that youth today are really under. A lot of the people I talk to when I first speak with them, I hear things like this. When people think of college students, they often think of college students being relatively happy. If you Google image search college students, you get images that look like this. Everybody's diverse and happy and smiling, even though they're working and so on. But that wasn't what I was seeing. And that's not what's also borne out in the national data. Just to give you a sense of what we're dealing with on college campuses right now, here's some recent awful statistics about college student mental health. This is from a recent National College Health Assessment, even a couple years ago. So these aren't 2020 statistics. This is from 2017. But here's what we're seeing nationally. So over 40% of college students report being so depressed it's difficult to function. Another 50% say that they feel hopeless most of the time. Another 60% say that they experience overwhelming anxiety, which is kind of the highest level of anxiety you can report on the scale. Another additional 60%-ish report feeling very lonely most of the time. And over 80% of college students say they constantly feel overwhelmed by all the things they have to do. And so when I first saw these statistics, I realized this is really bad. This is not, as some of like the national news might have us think, a few like snowflakes on campus, right? Like this is a real crisis in terms of our young people and in terms of our college age students. And so when I first saw this, I really wanted to do something about it. And the good news was that I had some hope. And my hope came from work on science, because what the research shows is that there are actionable practices that you can engage with, like really systematic behaviors that you can do to improve your mental health, even if you're not kind of feeling it in the moment. And this all comes from research on the science of happiness. And how does this research work? Well, scientists go out and they find these happy people. You can find them, they're out there even in 2020, even the day after a contentious election, you can find some happy folks. And then the research just asks, what are these people doing that's different than the rest of us? How are they behaving? What circumstances do they face, right? And from these kinds of investigations, you can figure out the kinds of things that individuals can do to boost happiness. And then you do some studies, you get the not so happy people to do the things that the happy folks are doing, and you often see that that will boost up well-being. And so we now have a couple whole decades of work on this topic of the science of well-being. So I thought, why don't I develop a whole new class to teach Yale students about it? I wanted it to sort of pop from the course catalog, so I christened it something fun. I called it Psychology in the Good Life, but it was a totally new class at Yale. I wasn't really sure what I was going to see. I expected about 30 students to take it. You've heard the punchline to the story a little bit, which is that I wasn't expecting to walk into a room that looks like this. This is what it looks like when a quarter of Yale's campus is trying to take your class. Over 1,000 students took the course. And I think this tells us a couple of things. This tells us that students were voting with their feet. They don't like this culture of feeling overwhelmed and anxious, and they really wanted to do something about it. They wanted to change this. And so that, as mentioned, was back in 2018, and it feels sort of especially prescient that so many Yale students wanted to take this class on happiness, because now when we fast forward to 2020, as many of you might be experiencing, this year hasn't been all that great. For me, it's kind of felt like a dumpster fire, to be totally honest, right? Not the least of which because many of us are facing, this awful global pandemic is causing a lot of uncertainty, a lot of stress, a lot of anxiety, and a lot of frustration, to be totally honest. Many of our routines are changing around in ways that are really upsetting. And that kind of raises this interesting question about how can we become happier in 2020? How can you, as folks who are working with youth, trying to train the youth, really engage in a way that improves your own well-being? And how can you find strategies that will work with the students that you work with so that they can improve their well-being as well? That's what we're going to engage with today. And in part because, it's nice to kind of condense things down, for the first short hour-long talk. We're going to try to get through 10 different insights I think we get from the science of happiness that are important during this time. And the first of these insights might be the most important, which is that even during a time like 2020, happiness is still important, right? Your own personal happiness is still important in these challenging times. And I think, sometimes when I give talks on this topic, people will say, okay, we're in the middle of a global pandemic. We're worried about people's jobs, we're worried about people's health and their lives. In some ways, how dare you talk about happiness during this time, right? Like happiness is this ephemeral thing. Why should we focus on that? Well, this is yet one of the many spots in which we have some misconceptions about what it means to be happy. Because what the data really suggest is that happiness isn't just this kind of, as my students might say, a sort of first world problem, right? Like the thing you worry about once everything else is sorted. The research really suggests that happiness matters for the kinds of things we consider the bottom line. Like, for example, our own immune function and health, something we're all worried about in the context of COVID. There's evidence that simply the act of experiencing positive mood can bump up your ability to avoid getting sick. This is one study by Cohen and colleagues. They brought people into the lab and sort of filled their nose up with a kind of syringe of rhinoviruses. These are the viruses that cause the common cold. And these researchers just looked at who got sick. And what they compared was people's positive style. I'll show you their graph in just a second, but positive style is this idea that you kind of react to the world in a positive way. So if you have a very high positive style, you're the kind of person who experiences a lot of joy, a lot of happiness, and so on. If you have a low positive style, you're kind of down in the dumps most of the time. You're just not experiencing a lot of positivity. The question is, does that positive emotional style affect the number of colds you get? And this is what researchers find. Basically, the people with the high positive emotional style, when exposed to the same amount of virus, are catching about half the colds of the people with the low positive emotional style. Again, this is something we really care about in 2020, right? Protecting ourselves from viruses. Again, this is rhinoviruses, not COVID. So, this is not necessarily all viruses, but the point is that our own positive style, our mood is actually affecting our ability to kind of regulate our immune systems, right? Like our ability to kind of ward off bad viruses, something we really care about during 2020. But it's not just our immune function. There's lots of evidence that other things we consider the bottom line, like getting a job, getting a high salary, the kinds of things that many of our youth are working towards, those things actually matter for in terms of happiness as well. And again, not in the way we think that you become happier once you get a job, once you get a high salary. The data suggests that you get happiness first, and then those other things will come. How do we know this? Well, this is a study by Roberts and colleagues that brought 18-year-olds into the lab and looked at their level of positive affect. So maybe around the age of youth you're working with, maybe a little older, but you bring people in at 18 and you try to see whether or not their positive affect in their teens predicts their work outcomes at 26. So almost 10 years later. So does your happiness as a teen predict your work outcomes in your 20s? And what the researchers found was yes. In fact, people's positive and negative emotions at 18 predict their occupational attainment. So it's whether or not they get a job. It predicts their work satisfaction, whether or not they like a job. And it predicts their financial security. It predicts what their salary is. Again, not that salary leads to happiness. It's that happiness at time one leads to a higher salary at time two. Now, again, this is not what we think, but it's showing us that happiness really matters in these challenging times. And I think this is really critical. We need to prioritize this in spite of everything that's going on. And that raises an interesting question. You might say, okay, that sounds great to prioritize happiness, but we're in 2020, everyone's really stressed. How do we do that, right? And that gets us to top insight number two, which I think is really critical. And that is that our circumstances don't matter as much for happiness as we think. We can, even in bad times, harness what researchers call the power of post-traumatic growth, this idea that trauma can sometimes bring happiness. Now, as I mentioned, this kind of comes from a different misconception, this idea that we often assume that great circumstances in life lead to happiness. Like, let's say you're this lady here, you've just won Massachusetts Powerball for $758 million. The question is, does that make you happy? And, the answer is that, on the Wednesday that this lady wins Powerball, like, yeah, she's pretty happy. Look at her face. Like, you are psyched the day you win $700 million. Question is, what happens to your happiness after that? 6 months later, 1 year later? What the data suggests is that your happiness pretty much goes back to baseline. Even when you have this kind of fantastic circumstance in your life, you don't get as happy as you think. And that seems generally true when we look at the research on things like money. We often think that getting more money would make us happier, but the data seem to suggest that that's not the case. It suggests we really think that. And I think this is a graph that I think will be of particular interest to folks working in youth ministry, because this one actually looked at what people think is important in life. These are students who are freshmen who are entering college and who are asked, what do you think is really important in life? And this is data that has looked across time. So we're looking at college students from the 1960s into the 2000s. The data actually stopped in 2000s. I think the graph might have even gotten worse. And what this data is telling us is that being very well off financially, while it wasn't that important back in the 1960s, is very important now. But not everything is as important now. In fact, when you ask the same freshman, how important is it to develop a meaningful philosophy on life? It looks like that is going down as the being well off financially is going up. I think we could kind of talk about why that is from the kinds of things you're seeing. But it's clear we think money is very important. The problem is, how much do we really need? It turns out when you ask people, they just tend to say that they need more and more and more. And so we know this from studies that look at the sort of surveys asking people like, how much salary would you really want? And so you can kind of play along at home. What's a number that I could put on your annual salary check that if you got that number, you really wouldn't need any more. Any more money wouldn't make you any happier. You can come up with your own amount, your own salary amount, right? And so researchers do this. They ask people at different salary levels. They ask people currently earning $30,000. They say, is that enough? People say no. How much money would you need so that more money wouldn't make you happy? These folks say, well, if I could only get $50,000, then I would be happy forever. More money wouldn't make me happy. So in theory, we should find the folks who are earning $50,000 right now, and they should just say they're fine. They don't need any more money. These researchers did one better. They actually went out and found the folks who are currently earning $100,000 and asked them if they were happy. Do you have enough? Surprisingly, based on the other results, these folks say no. When asked how much they need, they say they need $250,000. Now, two things here. One is that you never get to the amount where you feel like you have enough. But what's worse is as you get more money, the ratio is even bigger, right? So the difference between 30,000 and 50,000 is actually less than the ratio between 100,000 and 250,000, right? As we get more money, we end up wanting more. And so that's true with money. The research shows it's also true with material possessions, things like a perfect house or a perfect car. as we've gotten more and more prosperous as a nation, we've gotten more of these things, but it hasn't mapped on well to our well-being. In fact, you can look at this back in the 1950s and compare the kind of gadgets and material possessions we had then with a sort of modern day. This is modern day back in 2005, so a little bit less than modern day. If you compare people's happiness across these two times, even though we've gotten more material possessions, average happiness hasn't really changed. If anything, it's gone a little bit down. And this caused researcher David Myers, who has this wonderful book on the American paradox. He talks about spiritual hunger in this age of plenty. He notes that compared with their grandparents, today's young adults have much more affluence, slightly less happiness, and a much greater risk of depression and assorted pathologies. He goes on to note that our becoming much better off over the last 4 decades hasn't been accompanied by one iota of increased subjective well-being. Now, this is not what we think. We think better material possessions, being better off, we're happier. Just seems not to be the case. And so it's not money, it's not material possessions. And since you work with young people, I'll also note that it's not perfect grades. I see this at Yale where my students think, if only I could get a GPA or a report card that looked like this, I'd be happy. Is that really the case? Well, the data seems to suggest no. And if you have students that are focused on grades, I would highly recommend this book, Punished by Rewards by researcher Alfie Kohn, who's basically gone through to show how badly a focus on grades can impact learning and things, but how badly it can also impact our well-being. In fact, he actually looks at whether or not there's a correlation between the student's high school GPA and their well-being. So as your GPA goes up, does your well-being also go up? And what he finds is that there is a significant correlation, but it's what we call a negative correlation. In other words, as your GPA goes up, your well-being actually goes down. But it's not just your well-being. He finds the same sort of correlation between high school GPA and optimism. So as your GPA goes up, as you get more A's, your optimism goes down. He also finds the same correlation with self-esteem, which you might not predict. As your GPA goes up, your level of self-esteem actually goes down. So it's not the perfect grades. And in fact, the moral of the story is it's not the perfect anything, because what the data suggests is that sometimes bad circumstances, maybe in this case, getting bad grades or having less money or these kinds of things, paradoxically, that can sometimes have a more positive effect on our well-being than we think. Let's take a really extreme case of this. So imagine after this discussion, you go off for a ride and really bad news, you're in a car accident today. If you're lucky enough to have the use of your legs today, again, that's not guaranteed, it's gone from your life. You're a paraplegic after this accident, you'll never walk again. What does that do to your happiness? Well, that would be a very 2020 crummy Wednesday afternoon if that happened to you, if you found out you were paraplegic this afternoon. Fair enough, but what happens to your happiness 6 months later, 1 year later? What the data suggests is that your happiness would be statistically indistinguishable from the day before the accident. This is not what we expect, but it's what the data really show. But what's most profound is that the research also shows that the act of going through something tragic like this might actually improve your well-being. It might make you think that you now know what's really meaningful in life. It might strengthen your social connections, and it might give you a little bit more resilience. Now, that's not what we think. We don't think to bump up happiness, we should have a tragic event like this, but that's what the data suggests. And that's this term I used before, this idea of the power of post-traumatic growth. We often hear about post-traumatic stress, but what we don't tend to talk about is that through trauma, we also sometimes grow. And the research shows that we grow in 3 important ways. One is this idea of boosting our resilience. When you go through a really tough time, you stop sweating the small stuff after that, right? You kind of learn how strong you are and that you can get through things. That's sort of one benefit. But a second benefit is that we tend in tough times to boost our social connection, or we learn the people that are really there for us. And learning that can be incredibly powerful for our well-being. Finally, the research shows that going through something like a traumatic event can actually improve our sense of meaning in life. Often people go through these traumas and they realize what really matters, what gives them purpose. They often shift their life and even their career around, so changing the narrative of their own life. These positive things are post-traumatic growth. When we go through hard times, we can sometimes wind up stronger on the other side. And that's my hope for COVID-19, for all of you on this webinar and for all of your students, that we can harness the right sorts of strategies that get us to post-traumatic growth rather than post-traumatic stress. And we need to do that kind of given the tough situations many of us are facing, where our routines are messed up, we're scared to go outside, many of your students have their schooling messed up in a way that they've never had before, right? What can you do to promote post-traumatic growth so that going through this tough time will be for something, will lead to growth in the future? And that what Top Insight 2 is about, and also what the rest of these strategies are about. The rest of the 8 strategies I'm going to try to get through today are ones where we're going to be looking at how you can actually use this time to bump up your well-being through evidence-based practices that we know from the research really will help. And so without further ado, let's jump into some of those practices, starting with Top Insight number 3, that if we want to be like happy people, we need to make time for social connections. Every available study of happy people suggests that happy people are more social. They spend time with other people, they prioritize time with their friends and family members, they just tend to be a little bit more social than the average person, and that seems to map onto happiness. So it seems like, and the research shows, that kind of bumping up your social connection will also bump up your well-being. Of course, this is tricky during the time that we're finding ourselves, where we're, socially distancing from the people we care about, often our family members, probably your students and the youth you work with, right? This is a challenging time for social connection, and maybe a time that we need social connection more than ever. And so the question is, what can we really do to deal with this? And the evidence suggests that one way to think about social connection in the current time is to really be a little bit more intentional about it. Is to kind of seek out what I'm going to call here nutritious social connection. And so what do I mean by nutritious? Well, if you are the kind of person who pays attention to your physical health or cares about healthy eating, you might know what I mean by nutritious in the food domain, right? Like if I showed you a photo like this with lots of fruits and vegetables and nuts and things, you'd say, yeah, this is pretty nutritious. This kind of plant-based stuff is what we should be going after, right? If we want to have a nutritious diet. The idea is to think about what might be nutritious for your social connection, to try to treat your social interactions just like that, seeking out what might feel nutritious. Like, yeah, you might get kind of junk food social connection every once in a while, but right now during this hard time, you need to build in the nutrition. And how do you do that? Well, the key is just to be mindful about how you feel after different kinds of social connection and to get a sense of whether or not that felt nutritious. So how about something like this for all of you, going out with some friends, for drinks or having a nice dinner, like having really deep conversation with a small group of people you care about? Would that ultimately feel nutritious? The answer probably is like, yeah, that would, feel like that's what we're missing right now, right? Question is, what can you build in to kind of mindfully notice these other things that might feel nutritious, that we might not expect, but that feel just as nutritious? For example, calling a friend you haven't talked to in a while and really having a deep one-on-one conversation with them. How will that feel? Well, my guess is that if you really try that, that might feel nutritious. Like, most of this idea of us connecting with people we really care about in real time, that feels good. How about something else? Maybe a Zoom call with your students or like a Zoom happy hour or something like that. Will that feel nutritious for you? Like maybe if you haven't been on a screen all day and that's your contact and it's with a small number of people, it'll feel great. Maybe if you've just had 8 hours of Zoom calls, it'll feel really awful, right? The key is that it's not for me to tell you what feels good and what doesn't. It's for you to mindfully pay attention. And as you notice what feels good, to build more of that in over time. Right? Here's another one that I think is just worth noting right now. Sometimes our social connection is over the phone where we're just like looking at people's social media posts, looking at likes and things. Does that really feel nutritious? Well, again, it's kind of up for you to answer, but my guess is for most of us, if you pay attention, that doesn't feel great. It feels kind of apathetic. And sometimes afterwards, the evidence suggests we might even feel lonelier over time, right? But this is the key. We need to try things out very intentionally and ask ourselves whether or not things feel good and learn to kind of build in more of the stuff that feels nutritious to us. So that's Top Insight number 3. We need to make time for social connections and especially those that feel nutritious. Top Insight number 4 kind of builds on this sort of importance of social connection, which is that if we want to be like happy people, we need to focus on helping others, that helping others makes us feel in some ways happier than we expect. And again, I sort of feel like I'm preaching to the choir for folks who are working in ministry here. The importance of kindness and helping others, but sometimes we can get a little confused about this, especially in tough times. These days we have a lot of talk about self-care, treat yourself, like, self. We often think that happiness is about doing selfish things like, taking time for a bubble bath or, taking me time. And that's not to say that that stuff is bad, but the research shows that there's something else that could be good too, which is becoming a little bit more other-oriented. The research shows that people who donate their money and their time to charities are happier than those that don't. And people who are just generally other-oriented, where they're thinking about other people's happiness, not their own, tend to be a little bit happier. And so the evidence really suggests that those people are happier. Question is, can you bump up your happiness merely by focusing on others and doing nice things for others? And that's just what Liz Dunn and her colleagues tried to test in an experiment. She walked up to people on the street and handed them some money and asked them if they wanted to be in a study. And yes, most people say yes. So people say, yeah, I want to be in the study. They're asked to rate their happiness on a standard sort of 10-point happiness scale. Then they're given some money. They're either given $5 or $20. But the interesting thing is that they're told how to spend that. Liz tells people by the end of the day, you need to spend this money on yourself, or by the end of this day, you need to spend this money on someone else, do something nice for someone else. Then these subjects agree to get called back later in the day, and Liz is going to look at how their happiness changes from time 1 to time 2. And so Liz realizes first, though, that people have lots of misconceptions. So she first has a group of subjects predict, like, if you were in one of these conditions, which would feel better? And subjects generally predict the kind of self-care thing, the treat yourself idea. Spending money on yourself is going to feel better than spending money on other people. That's what people predict. But the question is, what really happens? And the answer is that what really happens is that it's just the opposite. People who spend the money on others at the end of the day, and even at the end of the week, are happier than the people who spent the money on themselves. And so the data really suggests that if we want to be happier during tough times, we need to become a little bit more other oriented. We need to focus on other people. Helping others is more of a path to happiness than we often realize. And I think this is important to recognize during the current time, because we sometimes have a few ways to help others now that are different than before. Many of us have a little bit more time on our hands. Maybe we're not commuting to work in the same way, or maybe we're not kind of spending our time, in the way that we used to before, because we can't like go out to movies or do the stuff we used to do. Can you spend that time helping others? Can you phone bank for a good cause? Can you, spend that time checking in on people, right? What can you do to use that little temporal windfall for something positive right now? And so that's top insight number 4. We need to focus on helping other people. Now we get to top insight number 5. Again, a thing I think that can be tricky during the current time. But if we want to follow the happiness research, we need to make time for gratitude. Most faith-based practices sort of have some idea of the importance of gratitude, right? We say grace and things like that. But when times are tough, we can forget the importance, right? Many of us in 2020 are spending a lot of our time, kind of complaining or griping or, talking negatively about the things that are happening. We forget the power of refocusing our energies on counting our blessings, shifting our attitude to the things that we're really grateful for in life. The research suggests that happy people naturally do that. But the research also suggests that even if that doesn't come naturally to you, there are practices you can engage with to do that even more. And one of the most famous practices to do so is to engage in what researchers call a gratitude journal or a gratitude list. And it sounds, maybe complicated, but it's quite simple. It's just at the end of the day, scribble down 3 to 5 things you're grateful for. The research shows that the simple act of doing this can start statistically improving your well-being in as little as 2 weeks. Just the simple act of writing down a few things you're grateful for. But there's an even more powerful way to experience gratitude. And that's not to just kind of notice it privately, in your own sort of self-reflection, but to actually express it to others. To do right, like to write someone, say, a thank you letter, or what's often called a gratitude letter. Why is a gratitude letter so powerful? Well, if you're paying attention to the other tips, you kind of know why. Telling somebody that you're grateful for them means that you have to have a social connection. You have to talk to them. It also means you're doing something nice for someone else, because of course we like it when people are really grateful for us, right? So it's a kind of nice way to do something nice for another person. And it means you're experiencing the gratitude that you have for that other person. So you're kind of getting like a triple threat of these like wonderful strategies to improve well-being. And what's surprising, even having seen this graph so many times, is the duration that you get from a boost like writing a gratitude letter, the way it impacts your well-being over time. And so I'm going to show you one study that did this. This is by Marty Seligman and his colleagues. He has people do what he calls a gratitude visit. So you don't just write a letter, you actually go to visit the person and read it. And so here's the prompt. He says, in the next week, I want you to write a letter of gratitude to someone who's helped you or been especially kind to you, but you've never properly thanked them. Then deliver that letter in person to the person in question. And in the best case scenario, when you meet up with them, read it to them. Don't just like hand it to them, like actually read to them and let them see your emotion of how affected you are by all their good deeds. What do people predict? People often predict that this is going to feel a little awkward or not very fun, or it might be weird for the person who gets the gratitude visit. The data really suggests that people who receive these visits often report it's one of the most touching moments of their life. Like these feel really good to the people who get them. But what's more amazing is how it feels to you, the person who does the gratitude visit. And that's the graph I'm going to show you now. I'm going to plot happiness. These are bigger bars means more happiness. I'm going to show you the white bars, which are the gratitude visit, versus the black bars, which are just a control where you list happy memories. So it should feel happy, but maybe not as happy. And so here's what happens before the gratitude visit, no difference in the bars. Here's what happens immediately after this gratitude visit test, like right after you get a big bump up in happiness. But what's amazing is that that bump up in happiness lasts. In fact, in Seligman's data set, he finds that that bump in happiness lasts not just a week, but sometime between 1 to 3 months, which is pretty incredible, right? If I told you there was something you could do tonight that might take you, half hour, an hour, and it would bump up your happiness, through the election results, past Thanksgiving, into the winter holidays, and maybe even into the new year, you would say, sign me up. 1 hour for, 2 to 3 months of happiness. What can I do? And that, it turns out, is the power of gratitude. We don't realize how powerful it is, but it can really have a huge effect on our well-being. And so that's top insight number 5. We need to be making time for gratitude, and we need to be expressing that gratitude to the people in our lives. It has a much bigger and much longer lasting effect on our well-being than we often think. That gets us to top insight number 6. Other counterintuitive things we don't expect are super relevant for our well-being, but one of them is the power of exercise. The research suggests that we need to move our bodies a little bit if we want to feel better. And so we all know that exercise is important for our physical health, right? It helps our heart stay healthy and it helps us stay fit. We forget how important exercise can be for our mental health. One study suggests that a simple half hour of cardio a day actually can impact your well-being as much as a prescription of Zoloft, one of the leading antidepressant medications. The same is true for symptoms of anxiety. Exercise is just having a huge impact on our mental health, even though we often don't realize it. The problem, though, is that when times get tough, like during COVID, what often happens is our normal exercise practice goes out the window. Some of us, when our gyms close down or when things get busy or when we're really stressed, as the holiday season comes up, like exercise is the first thing to go. And what's sad is that that's exactly the time we need to be doubling down more on exercise rather than less. And so this is a big thing that I think we can all be doing and we can all encourage our students to be doing during this time of COVID-19 is to engage with exercise a little bit more, which again is a little tough because many of us are stuck in our houses. We can't go to our gyms or, maybe like participate in sports together in the same way as before. But all of us can grab a yoga mat or a towel and, look online for one of the many free different fitness classes that we can engage with. Or even if that's really tricky, you can just do like 20 jumping jacks in your room. The simple act of building in movement, especially when you're busy and you don't feel like you have time, can be a powerful way to bump up your well-being. And so that's top insight number 6. If we want to be like happy people, we need to sort of take time to move our body and make our body feel better. But that's not the only physical health tip that really affects our mental health. That gets us to top insight number 7, which is that if we want to be like healthy people, another physically healthy habit we need to engage with even more is to make sure we're getting sleep. We need to prioritize our healthy sleep hygiene. And now, again, this is something we kind of know that sleep is important for our mental health. If you stayed up, watching the election results come in, you might recognize this morning that, sleep was probably important for your mental health. But we forget how critical it is, how much even small decreases in sleep can have a huge impact on our mental health. And I actually think this is something of incredible importance to convey to the youth that you work with. These days, college students self-report getting only about 5 hours of sleep a night, which is several hours less than they're supposed to be getting. I actually think that if we could get college students and young individuals to sleep more, we might be able to clear up the mental health crisis that we're all facing right now. And I think that in part because of data like this, you look at kind of, like sleeplessness in students. This is one study by Dinges in college that looked at this directly. They ran a sleep lab where they bring subjects into the lab and they test their mood across different levels of sleep. And so subjects in this study first start off the study by getting normal sleep for 2 days. Normal, by the way, what we're supposed to be doing is 7 to 8 hours a night. That's what we're all shooting for. Then subjects get sleep that's deprived. They actually only get sleep for 5 hours a night for 7 days for a whole week. And then the researchers aren't evil. So then they allow students to go back to a normal amount of sleep for 2 days, right? So they go back to 7 to 8 hours. And the question is just what happens to your mood across this time course. And that's the graph I'm going to show you right now. I'm going to plot what's called a profile of mood score. Basically, what it means is bigger numbers are higher mood. And as you get to numbers at the bottom of the scale, it kind of looks like you have a mood that looks like you have clinical depression. And here's what happens after just a week of restricted or diminished sleep. Basically, soon into the diminished sleep, you see a mental health tank. And by the end of that week, you kind of look like you're showing mental health levels that look like you have clinical depression. Again, I actually think we could clear up a lot of our students' anxiety, depression, all the bad mood stuff they're facing if we could just convince them to get a little bit more sleep. And so that's top insight number 7. We need to prioritize healthy sleep hygiene. And I say not just healthy sleep, I say healthy sleep hygiene, because sometimes our sleep needs a little help. There's lots of things that we could be doing late at night that some of you might have been doing late last night that can not allow us to sleep, in part because of the blue light that we experience. You're sort of changing your body's wakefulness just in terms of your hormones, but also because sometimes what we're looking at when we're not sleeping on our phones is the kind of thing that can be really anxiety provoking. And just that anxiety can sort of keep us up and lead to insomnia. So what does healthy sleep hygiene look like? It looks like putting your technology away before you go to bed and giving your youth and your students some tips that they can use to put their technology away before they go to bed. It means making sure you prioritize sleep, so you really schedule it in, and that you do so especially during tricky times. Again, when times aren't stressful, maybe we're getting our 8 hours, but as soon as things get busy, and the holidays come in, things are stressful, sleep is the first to go. And it should be just the opposite. That is a time we need to double down on even more sleep and even healthier sleep hygiene. And so that's top insight number 7. We need to really make sure we're prioritizing the right amount of sleep and the right kind of sleep. And sometimes we need to do that at the sacrifice of all the devices that we're so used to. But the rewards can be really powerful. So that's top insight number 7. We're kind of getting harder and harder for the youth that I think you work with, and in some ways harder and harder for ourselves too. And that gets us to top insight number 8, which is that if we want to be like happy people during a tough time, we need to take time to be in the present moment and to kind of make sense of the present moment and be there with it, so that we can savor the good things that are there if we take time to notice. Even in 2020, there's lots of joyful things that we can pay attention to if we're just present and notice them. Like the taste of our, morning coffee, or, the look of our partner or child's smile. Like those things are still there even in tough times. Problem is, we don't tend to be around to notice it because our minds are doing this sort of thing all the time. This is my favorite physical representation of what researchers call mind wandering. So you're thinking about, what you're going to make for dinner tonight, or you're thinking about the election results we're going to know, several days from now, or you're thinking about, that comment that someone made to you that makes you feel sad. We're just not there because our minds are constantly going to these other things. Researchers try to estimate how often our minds wander, which is kind of tricky, like how often are you not paying attention? But they did this in a clever way. They bring people, they give people little cell phone apps that ping people at different times and ask people 3 questions. They ask, what are you doing right now? Are you paying attention to what you're doing? And how are you feeling? And when they ask people this, what they find is that people self-report that whatever they're doing, their minds are wandering just under half the time. So 46.9% of the time when I asked you, what are you doing? Are you paying attention? You say, no matter what you're doing, no, I'm not paying attention. I'm just like thinking about something else, which is kind of philosophically sort of sad, honestly, right? That we're kind of missing half of our life. But what's most sad is I think what happens to our well-being. As I mentioned, these researchers also asked, and how are you feeling? And they tried to look at people's feeling levels across different forms of mind wandering. And that's what I'm going to show you now. I'm going to plot how people are feeling from 0, like really bad, to 100, super good. And here's what people report at different kinds of mind wandering. For this left dot, unpleasant mind wandering, when you're thinking about, that fight you had with your spouse or something yucky, like that doesn't feel good when you're mind wandering to that stuff. But even when you're mind wandering to neutral things, like what I'm going to have for dinner tonight, or even pleasant things like, I'm thinking about an upcoming vacation or something in the future that's going to make me happy. All of those things are simply not as good as just not mind wandering at all, as just being present no matter what the present moment entails. And so that raises a question, right? How can we stop all this mind wandering? How can we shut this off so we can actually be present, in our day? Well, it turns out the research suggests there are 2 techniques. One is one that you can turn on at any moment, and it's the simple act of what scientists call savoring. Savoring is just turning on your attention resources so you pay attention, ideally when something good is happening. So you're eating a delicious ice cream cone, stop and notice it, stop and think, what does this taste like right now? How does this feel right now? How would I describe what this is doing in my body right now? Like, how would I talk about this to a friend? Really pay attention and get curious about the details of your event. That's the act of savoring. And just by paying attention and noticing, we can be there when we're having a joyful event, and that can kind of boost up our mood. So that's a thing you can do at any time. But researchers are also interested in a very different practice. That's the kind of thing where you reduce your mind wandering over time, kind of like doing bicep curls at the gym, which can let you carry heavy luggage later. That is what this process, meditation, seems to do. Meditation, the simple act of forcing your mind to pay attention to something, forcing yourself to pay attention to your breath or a mantra or a feeling like a feeling of gratitude or compassion, the active practices that allow us to kind of, every time our mind wanders, yank it back, those types of practices seem to really reduce our capacity to mind wander and therefore end up building up our well-being muscles. In fact, that the research suggests that even novice meditators who begin doing so for, a couple minutes a week, 10 to 15 minutes a week, within about 2 weeks, you're changing around the firing patterns of regions of your brain that tend to mind wander so that you're mind wandering less, not while you're meditating, because of course you're mind wandering less while you meditate because you're sort of forcing yourself to pay attention to your breath. You're mind wandering less throughout your day. So when you're having a conversation with your spouse, or when you're trying to pay attention to something at work, or when one of you, the students you work with is trying to pay attention to their schoolwork, it just comes easier because you did that practice of yanking your attention back over and over. Tons and tons of benefits of practices like meditation, in part because they seem to help us reduce mind wandering. So that's top insight number 8. We need to find ways to be in the present moment so that we can be there and notice all the good stuff. But top insight number 8 has a corollary that is top insight number 9, which is that we need to not just be in the present moment when everything's great, when we're savoring a nice ice cream cone or something. The research suggests if we want to be happy, we also need to be in the present moment, even when the present moment sucks, to be totally honest. And this feels, again, very needed, on the morning after a contentious election where we still don't know the results yet. If you were looking at my emoji feed last night, you would have noticed things like this. And I think not just during the election, but just during 2020 in general, we're experiencing a lot of negative stuff, from uncertainty to frustration to anxiety. Like, it's not felt great. And our instinct when things don't feel great is to run away from those emotions, is just not to experience them, to distract ourselves, or to just, full stiff upper lip, just pretend it's not happening. We don't want to be there with them. But the research suggests that that's a bad strategy, that avoiding our emotions actually makes them worse. We know this from some studies by James Gross and his colleagues that forced subjects to suppress their emotions. They'd have subjects watch a really sad movie or a really disgusting movie and tell subjects, whatever you do, try not to feel those emotions, try to suppress what you're feeling. And what they found was a couple things. One is that subjects kind of can't do this, right? It's really hard to do this. And in fact, even when we're trying to suppress our emotions, it doesn't usually work. But suppressing our emotions also has lots of negative consequences. One is that it affects our thinking. So these researchers actually saw memory losses. You do worse on a memory test when you're suppressing your emotions versus when you're just allowing them to be there. But what's worse is that we stress out our bodies. You actually can find signals of cardiac stress when we're trying to suppress our emotions. Again, not just feeling the negative emotions, but really trying to shut them off. And so the data suggests that we shouldn't suppress our negative emotions, but they raise a question about, like, okay, well, then how do we get through them? Because it'd be nice to shut off COVID and shut off all the nasty things in 2020. That's not going away. How do we deal with our emotions? And the right way, like with our emotions, is sort of through them. We have to just be there to experience it. And so the good news is that science gives us a few practices that we can try to do this. They're practices that actually come out of non-secular traditions, things like meditation and so on. But one of the ways that researchers have talked about it is to try to help us through this process by giving us some convenient acronyms that we can use to get through it, to kind of be there with our emotions. And one of these acronym practices is a practice popularized by the meditation teacher Tara Brach that's called RAIN. And so I'll walk you kind of through the way this works. So the RAIN method is an acronym, RAIN, that stands for recognize, accept, investigate, and nurture. And so the first step in the method is to recognize what's happening, right? When you notice something's feeling bad, you need to kind of call a spade a spade. You say, aha, that thing I'm feeling right now, that is uncertainty, that is stress, that is anxiety, that is frustration, like that is anger, right? Like, recognize what it is and call it what it is, like literally label it. And then you do the practice of A, which is to allow. Kind of hard, but you just allow the feeling to be there just as it is. Don't try to run away from it, just allow it to be there. I often use the analogy of like that kind of crappy neighbor who pre-COVID used to come over and you didn't really want them to show up, and now they're here and you kind of have to talk to them for 20 minutes and you kind of don't get along with them, but like, you're not going to kick them out. You're just going to allow them to be there. You're not going to fight it. You're just going to let it be. I often use the phrase, you're cool. Okay, hey, anxiety, you're here. You're cool. Allow it to be there. Don't fight it. But then in addition to not fighting it, dig in, like develop some curiosity and really investigate with interest and with care what this feels like in your body right now. Like, is your chest getting tight? Can you notice like your brow is sort of feeling tense? Maybe you have certain kind of cravings. Maybe you crave, wanting to eat some fattening food, or maybe you crave wanting to go on social media or just do something distracting, right? Like watch what it's doing to your mind and your body as though you were a kind of journalist investigating what this phenomenon is like. And then because the data really suggests that that kind of investigation can cause the emotion to go away. Emotions are sort of like a wave. And if we can hang out with them and really get curious about them and pay attention to them, they sort of dissipate over time. And that's when we end with the N, which is to sort of nurture, like with some self compassion. Don't beat yourself up for feeling bad. That's like the worst thing we can do. What would you do if this was a child that you were working with who is going through this emotion? What if it was like someone you really cared about? How can you extend that same nutritious self compassion to yourself? How can you actually nurture yourself? Not by letting yourself run away from it, right? Be there with it, but do something nice to yourself to nurture yourself during this moment. And I think the research suggests that rain is a practice that we really should be teaching as a coping skill to a lot of our students, who go through all kinds of things in their daily life when they could use it. They get some bad news on social media or a bad grade, or they like are feeling down about themselves, or just have this moment of imposter syndrome, all these things. Like what they should do is have a moment where they recognize, like teach them words to call it what it is, and then work with them to kind of allow it. What can you do to not enjoy it, but like be there with it? Don't run away from it. And like, can you get really curious and investigate it? Like, okay, stupid feeling. Now you're here. Like, let's dig in and see what you feel like, and kind of know so that when you come back again, I'll notice what you feel like. And then what can you do to encourage them to nurture themselves in a really healthy way, not with like a substance or by running away, but by something that's really nutritious. And the nutritious things are the stuff we talked about: self-care, turning to others, social connection, all the stuff we talked about. The research really shows that if you can still be in the present moment when it sucks, you'll avoid all the negative costs of emotional suppression, but also you'll be able to get through your emotions. You'll be able to allow the bad stuff in a way that will protect you from some of life's worst things. And so that's up insight number 9. And now in some ways we get to what I think for our youth is maybe the hardest insight, and maybe the hardest for all of us who help our youth too, which is that if we want to be like happy people, we need to become wealthy, but not wealthy in terms of money, like we talked about before, wealthy in terms of time. And this is a concept that social psychologists have become really interested in lately, this concept of what's called time affluence, being wealthy in time. Time affluence is the subjective sense that you just have some free time. If I ask you if there's time we can meet in your calendar, you're not like, how about never, because my calendar is full. You just feel like you have some flux in the amount of time you have. Time affluence is the opposite of what many of us and many of the youth today feel, which is what's known as time famine, where you feel like you're starving for time. You're really like starved just for a few free moments every day. The research shows that time famine is a lot worse for our well-being than we think. One study finds that if you self-report being time famished, that's as big of a negative impact on your well-being as if you self-report being unemployed. So we all get, really up in arms and we want to, fix unemployment and make sure people have jobs. Turns out the well-being hit from just feeling so time strapped is just as powerful. And so you might say, that sounds great. I'd love to promote a feeling of time affluence, but like, right now, like in the middle of COVID, like, I'm running a family daycare, I'm running a school, like I'm managing, elderly individuals who I'm worried about their health. Like I'm more time strapped than ever, right? Like, how do I experience time affluence? Well, the good news is that time affluence isn't the objective amount of free time you have. It's really the subjective sense that you have some time. And that means that counterintuitively, we can often bump up our time affluence simply by reframing things as giving us a little bit more time. And one of the ways to do that is to reframe the things you are doing in life that give you more time that we often don't think about that way. So maybe some of you in the last couple of weeks have gotten, takeout. Hopefully you're not eating at restaurants during COVID inside, but, some of you might be getting takeout to support local restaurants. We often think about that really, in whatever way it's nice to kind of get some food out, but we forget that it's a saving in time, right? When you got that food taken out, how long would it have taken you to create that food yourself? If you were chopping all the vegetables and frying the potatoes and all that stuff, like you probably saved like 3 hours or something. Like, what did you do with those extra 3 hours? Did you spend them well? Did you spend them positively? The simple act of shifting can actually make us realize that we are giving ourselves more time than we think. It can bump up the subjective sense that we have more time. But beyond that, these kinds of things show us that there's a way that we can get more time, which is that sometimes we can spend money to get some time back. We can get takeout. We can hire the neighbor's kid to mow our lawn. Maybe we're privileged enough, you have a little extra money, we can hire someone to help clean our house and things like that. Research shows that if you make time saving purchases, if you spend the flux money you do have to get back more time, that's better than spending it on material possessions. Because what you get back is like the sense of time affluence that can be quite powerful. But there's a final way that we can really bump up our time affluence, and that's by making good use of the time we do have. And this gets to this concept that I quite love these days, which is this concept of time confetti. So it turns out that if you look at people's schedules, even though we're feeling more time famished than ever as a society, we actually, in terms of the objective amount of time we have been going up in time. We have more time now free than we did 10, 15 years ago, which is shocking, but that's what the data suggests. The problem is how that time is broken up. And that's where this concept of time confetti comes in. Is it turns out that what we have in our free time is broken up in these tiny little pieces of time, 5 minutes here before a Zoom meeting or 10 minutes before your student shows up, here and there. Like we have these tiny little chunks of time that make it feel hard to do something with. That's time confetti. Our time is broken up into these tiny little chunks. But the research shows that if you make good use of those chunks, you can actually bump up your time affluence. Problem is we don't normally do that. When we have 5 minutes here or there, it's like, oh, I'll just hop on social media or do something dumb, right? What can you do with that time confetti that would feel nutritious? Researcher Ashley Willens, who's a professor at Harvard who studies time affluence a lot, she has a wonderful book called Time Smart that's worth checking out. She recommends making a time confetti wish list so that whenever you find yourself with the 5 minutes here and there, you'll actually notice that like there's something you can do, right? Like you'll look down at the list and say, oh, like this is when I'll text a friend, or this is when I'll, like do a 5-minute breath or like a quick prayer, right? These are the times when you can build things in that really feel good. We just have to remember that that's at our disposal. And so that's top insight number 10. We need to be making time for time. We need to be prioritizing time almost as much as we prioritize our monetary wealth. It might be as important, if not more important. And so those are your top 10 insights from the class that I teach, and also what you can do in 2020. And now I want to open up for questions. But before we do, I kind of want to end the story where I began, because the way this started was, I was worried about my stressed out students at Yale, and I wanted to change that culture, but it kind of went beyond the classroom. The class went a little bit viral, which is, I think, one of the reasons I'm here talking to all of you today. We were talked about in kind of the New York Times and all over the place. And that's why I've been trying to give this content out to as many groups as I can for free. One of the things we've done is we've put the entire Yale class online on Coursera.org. It's called The Science of Wellbeing, just there for free for you or any of the youth you work with to take. And a lot of people have taken it, especially during COVID. In fact, just during COVID, we've bumped up about 3 million learners who've taken the class, which is really quite humbling. And just so you get a sense that this is a global time in 2020 when things are tough, here's just a graph of where we have our learners. It's kind of a worldwide phenomenon, pretty humbling to see how many people need these insights. And as Jill mentioned before, if you're thinking, I'm time famished, I don't have time for a whole Yale class, we also have all these insights sort of squished down into podcast form. Another wonderful thing to recommend to the folks you work with, these short 20-minute bursts where you can learn some of these strategies with these fun kind of narrative elements. And we even have a whole season on coronavirus and how you can stay happy during this tough time. So with all that, I hope I've convinced you that the path to happiness is there. It is important, even in really tricky times. It matters for the things that are our bottom line. It's possible. And if you know the right strategies, you can kind of jump in and engage with it. So with that, I'll express my gratitude to Jill for inviting me here to talk to you. And I look forward to your questions. Thank you so much.
Laurie, thank you so much. This has been tremendous. My notes are completely filled on this piece of paper with questions and thoughts about what you were sharing. And I imagine that's true of others in this presentation as well. Thank you. A couple of questions coming in from the chat, just a logistical clarification. Some folks were wondering about the title of the Time Confetti book and the name of the Harvard professor you referenced.
Yeah, so the book is called Time Smart. It seems like what we want to do is become smart with time. So Time Smart, and her name is Ashley Willens, Willans. Really highly recommended, both the tips I gave, but lots of other tips in there too.
Thank you. Thank you. We also know that you are in the process of developing the happiness curriculum for high school students. Can you speak a little bit about how that development is going and what that entails?
Yeah, so I mean, the response to the class was really tremendous. But I think one of the things we really learned was that, the kinds of mental health issues I was talking about in my college students weren't just in college students, right? My students honestly were arriving here from high school and even middle school in some cases with anxiety, with depression, with suicidality, and these things. And so we thought, what if we could get these kinds of tips in even earlier, so I didn't have to wait till they got to, college to teach them this? Wouldn't it be great if we knew these strategies even earlier? And so we're working with a few foundations to develop high school versions of this content. One of that is like a whole high school class that students can take. We're working with the Ed Equity Foundation to get the class into Title I schools so that students can actually get a college credit in Title I schools to get that. So one version is like this whole class, but for high school students. Another is trying to develop smaller modules that teachers can use and kind of work with in small units. So like a unit on gratitude or a unit on time and so on. And sort of we're developing those materials. That slowed down because we'd hoped to be able to film it like we filmed our Coursera class, which was, in my lovely head of college house, where we had this little salon. I had students come. We'd worked with high schools around the area to get students to commit to this. And then we weren't able to bring anybody into anybody's houses anymore. So we're kind of trying to revisit how we're creating that content right now. But I'd love information from you all about what you think would be useful in your own work, or the kinds of things you've seen in schools that would be useful. If you sign up on my website, which I can throw into the chat, which is just drlauriesantos.com, we have a growing list of people of signups. So if you want to sign up to kind of just get announcements about content, if you sign up there, we can send you any updates that we have as we get them.
Yeah, that'd be great. It'd be great to keep in touch with our institute and with you on the development of those things. That's pretty exciting. Yeah. Okay, we had another question, and it's similar to one that I had for you as well. So we are just coming out of this election time, which will undoubtedly have really significant consequences for people's happiness, no matter what the results will be. Um, how is happiness to be found, especially for those who might find themselves in a group that has been historically underrepresented or historically oppressed? Um, where it's not just a matter of uncertainty or sitting with hard emotions, it's a matter of safety and security.
Yeah.
What does that look like?
Yeah, so I think it is an important qualification to one thing I said, which is, I often talk about this idea that, you know, happiness doesn't necessarily come from our circumstances, right? We think we have to change our circumstances. We need a new job or higher salary to get happier. That's not typically the case. And I see that knowing the audiences I'm often talking about, right? I'm guessing, I'm talking to a group of youth ministers, like most of you have a roof over your head, I assume. Most of you have reasonable pay. Like most of you, if you changed your circumstances, it wouldn't affect your happiness that much. But that's not true to all the audiences I talk to, right? If you are in an abusive situation, if you don't have a roof over your head, if you can't put food on the table, then your circumstances do matter. You need a kind of reasonable amount of like salary and safety to have circumstances that will protect you, right? And I think that's really important to kind of make clear. So, if you're working with students who are in that position, work on those circumstances first, because they do matter, right? Like we really need to solve those situations so that everybody will be at the kind of baseline that many of us are at. The key though is that once you're at that baseline, then a lot of the suffering can be like self-created in a lot of ways, right? My Yale students' main stressors are that they're incredibly time famished because they're taking on so many extracurriculars that they're so time strapped they hate them all, or they are so deeply worried about their grades when, like, you're at Yale, if you got B pluses, literally no one's going to care, right? And so it's trying to make sure that it is not the case that no circumstances matter. Definitely a lot of them do, but we need to pay attention when the ones we're really worried about aren't the ones that are going to affect our happiness. Another thing to say is, you asked about kind of marginalized communities and what they're really facing right now. I think that, that comes with a special kind of uncertainty and anxiety and fear, because it also comes with a lot of unfairness, right? When Black individuals are looking at this election, they're seeing it in a way that will potentially affect their lives and their safety in a way than many white Americans are looking at this election. If you're an LGBTQ person, you're looking at this election and the possibility of switching your rights around in a way that must be incredibly scary, right? And so I think that in many of those cases, those emotions are deeper and richer and more, the negative emotions are like more urgent and more scary scary. They also come with like a deep sense of social injustice. One of the things we know predicts happiness cross-culturally is just a sense of fairness, like an equality, income inequality and equality in all kinds of different domains. One of the reasons that the United States, which is an incredibly wealthy nation, is not a very happy nation is because we have so much inequality. You can look to nations that are way less rich than us, but more equal. Like, so a lot of people don't have a lot and they tend to be a lot happier. And so that kind of inequality is a special hit on our well-being, especially from if you're from a marginalized group that's facing the inequality head on. And so I think for those groups, though, I think the key is to help them see that there are strategies they can use to feel better. We need to like be fighting the injustices at the same time as we're giving ourselves the self-care resources to do this stuff. And so one misconception that often happens is, when I talk about this stuff, you say, well, you're just telling people to like, write down what they're grateful for and meditate, but like, don't you think we should also like stop the injustices? I'm like, oh yeah, like, that needs to come first. Like, I didn't say that because I thought we were all on the same page, right? But yes, definitely we need to fight that stuff first. But what I think is true, and what a lot of activists have echoed, is that to do that, you need some bandwidth, right? Like you need to put your own oxygen mask on first. And these are strategies you can really use to do that. I think it was Audre Lorde, who I'm going to badly paraphrase, noted that, self-care is a political act, like it is an act of political activism. And that's because it gives you the kind of strength and resilience to fight all the other stuff later.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It's a countercultural act of resilience and resistance to the status quo and to the oppressive regimes thereof. Yeah. Let me ask you this. So how might those of us working with youth, how might we cultivate post-traumatic growth without personally traumatizing our youth?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't recommend, hurting them so they're paraplegic or, giving them.
Right, exactly. So yeah, I mean, is it possible? Is there a way that we can promote empathy such that, perhaps the youth can kind of jump into someone else's shoes and experience that understanding? Is there any science behind that?
Yeah. Well, I think, everybody goes through tough times, right? I was, in some ways kind of, like belittling in some sense the fact that a lot of my Yale students' stress is sort of self-imposed about grades and their extracurriculars and things. But, compassionately, that's just as much stress as other people experience, right? Like it's causing them harm, it's causing them a lot of sadness. And I think if you take a compassionate look at it, you can often see that they need just as much help, right? But the key is that, all of us go through things that are stressful and harmful, right? We may not call it trauma necessarily, but all these kinds of stresses can sort of make us stronger if we use them correctly. And the key to this post-traumatic growth is really to like recognize like how this sort of tough time is shaping your own narrative, right? And to really have a narrative change that comes with it. So the post-traumatic growth, is like increased sense of meaning and social connection, comes with it comes with allowing yourself to sort of watch this narrative change. Like for you to realize, hey, this awful thing that I went through changed me and it made me stronger. And so I think one way that you can help your youth towards that is that if they're going through tough times, even if they're, like tough times light, in the way that, we sometimes work with students who are going through that sort of thing, if you can help them to reframe that as something that they grew through, as something that made them stronger, as something that taught them something important, if you help them get to that narrative, that can be really powerful. And if you, especially given that you're kind of working in the ministry domain, if you can work with them to use that moment to think about what's meaningful to them and what they learned in terms of the bigger picture, all the more powerful.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, thank you. How might we help youth experience gratitude and name and claim that important skill? What are some practical tips you would have for us?
Yeah, well, one is to just kind of get them to engage in this practice. I bet all of you could incorporate a gratitude letter into some of the practices you work with your youth on, right? Make that their homework or make that their activity. And again, the research shows that even if you kind of don't buy it, if you do it, you get a lot of the benefit from it. Like you don't have to like buy in, you just have to do it. And then like you'll see, your mom, if your youth writes a like gratitude letter to their mom will like cry, happy tears, and then they'll kind of feel warm. And like, so even if you don't believe it, it still kind of works. And so I think your main goal is to get your youth in all these cases for gratitude and beyond, to like get them to engage in the practice. And get them to reflect on the practice, right? After, if you get into a situation where you're working with students who are like griping and complaining a lot and kind of having a like, like kind of, upset fest, like have them afterwards, like remind them mindfully, like, "Oh, how did you feel after that?" You know, like let's check in. Is like, how did that really make you feel? And like people are aware. They're like, "Oh, that didn't feel good. That felt crummy," right? You know, or if they're on social media, you know, posting all these like angry memes and things like, you know, how did that make you feel afterwards? Did it work, right? And often one of the things we really struggle with scientifically, or one of the struggles that science points out if you look carefully, is that we have these misconceptions about what's going to feel good. We assume lots of things are going to feel good, and we do them with the hypothesis that they're going to work, and they just don't, right? You know, we have the hypothesis that like, you know, shutting off after an election and not looking at anything, or distracting myself, or eating something unhealthy, or whatever, like drinking a lot, right? Like that's going to feel good. And you know, you want to ask this morning, like, okay, how'd that go? You know, when you open that second bottle of wine at 10 p.m., like, how'd that go, right? And I think you can do a lot when you're working with your students to remind them of that. You know, do that like, how'd that go? Question. Let them come to the insight themselves about what felt good and what didn't. I think for the complaining and the gratitude piece, that can be really powerful.
Yep. Thank you. That's great. A question here too about how to work with youth who strive really hard to be successful. You've named your students are kind of in this camp, and that's shocking, right? And that's true even for high schoolers and middle schoolers as well. So I know of seventh graders who are talking about what kind of classes they want to be in eighth grade so that they can get to the honors and AP classes in high school, and the rat race continues. So, what would you say, what kinds of tips would you give us for helping youth focus instead on things that actually are good metrics for their happiness, while also knowing it's not just the youth, it's the parents who kind of feed some of this rigmarole?
Yeah, totally. And I think the parent point is really critical. In fact, when we started the project of doing content for high school students, one of my implicit goals was actually to get this content to parents, because I think, you know, students often see this stuff, right? Like they see that this stuff is stressful, it's not helping them, and it's hard for them to push back because the parents, I think incredibly, you know, well-intentioned. I'm very compassionate towards the parents. Like, you know, meritocracy is tough, right? And you want to do everything for your kid, and you like think that the root there is like, you know, kind of worrying about their grades and their accolades and all this stuff. And what you're doing is creating like mental health issues that might stick around for the entirety of your kid's life without realizing it. And it's deeply sad that that's happening, but that's kind of what happens. And so, how to fix this? I think one of the ways I've found works well, both with students and with parents, although it feels a little icky to engage with, because I want students to like want to embrace happiness and their well-being in its own right. But the data that I started with, that like actually happiness matters for your bottom line, does convince parents. When you say you want your kids to get good grades, what's one way? If they have a positive emotional style, like if they're mentally happy, like that's going to impact their grades positively, right? You want them to get a good job. Actually, their mood at 18 is going to predict their job in their 30s, right? Like people, like that's like, whoa, like again, that's not the reason I want people to like, I want people to do it. But when my Yale students hear that, when I put up the graph of like, you're killing yourself with a million econ classes and like, you know, things to boost your resume and making yourself miserable, and actually your mood might be a stronger predictor of what happens in your 30s of your job and your salary, like that's like a whoa moment. And you know, I showed you job statistics, but the same, if you read Alfie Kohn's work, is really true for grades too, right? Like again, the kids with the best well-being are having the best grades. Like parents want their kids to be optimistic, they want their kids to have good self-esteem. Good grades aren't the path to that. So I think trying to educate parents so they realize that this stuff is important for the bottom lines they care about, um, and trying to get them to this idea that sometimes you can get off track a little bit. Like what parents want is for their kids probably to have like a meaningful, happy life, right? They just think the path to that is like frantically obsessing over grades, and you can kind of bop them back to the right track and sort of show them how off track they go. So.
Laurie, how much influence do neurotransmitters play into this whole exchange? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, definitely some. I mean, I focus on the behavior, but of course, all of these are happening in biological systems, right? They're like controlled by richer mechanisms. And so, you know, I could have presented, say, the meditation research in terms of different brain areas, right? About how meditation, you know, literally is changing your gray matter. You actually grow gray matter in regions of your brain that focus when you do meditation. I could talk about how like something like gratitude, like, like feels rewarding, right? Like boost dopamine, right? In the same way that a cocaine hit might, right? So all these things are happening through biological mechanisms. And so, we could get into the specifics on all of them, but I think one thing to realize is that sometimes this stuff sounds fluffy, right? Like, oh, we're gonna talk about happiness or gratitude or joy or, like a being allowing emotions, right? But like, no, that's having changes in my brain. It's having changes in my immune function. It's having changes in my cardiac system, right? And so that honestly is another way you can sometimes get people who find this stuff like, oh, it's ephemeral, oh, happiness. It's like, well, do you want your kids to have cardiac stress? Do you want their immune function to suffer? Like, you can kind of point to those biological mechanisms, and that sometimes gets people to realize like this is real. This matters in a way that I should pay attention to.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. I'm curious about time affluence, especially when working with youth. And, it's a very countercultural suggestion, right? To be able to say, hey, you need to carve out this time. And actually, you have it. It's a matter of being more intentional and noticing and having eyes to see what is in your day-to-day routines and what you can cultivate there. So, how might we model that for our youth as, those of us who are overextended adults in this circle? And, how might we help youth to see this and to really own it?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think a couple of things there. One is that I think recognizing the concept can be just powerful, kind of call it something, when you tell people about time famine, when you tell them about time confetti, I feel like people have this like aha moment. I was joking with Ashley, who's a colleague of mine, about her new book. And she's like, new authors like, oh, are people going to buy? I'm like, everyone's going to buy your book. It's like everyone, like when they hear this concept, is like, tell me more, like fix this. And so I feel like, kids recognize this, right? It's giving them tools to kind of talk about it and tools to recognize what it's doing to them, right? I mean, the research shows that biologically, time famine works a lot like hunger famine, right? You're triaging stuff all over the place, right? Like you're just trying to get things off your list. Like often you'll take on less big projects and do tiny things just because you want to be ticking things off, right? And I think all of us who are busy know that sense, right? Like how often did you like do a bunch of stuff during the day, but they were the little things you could just get out of your inbox or get off your to-do list. And at the end of the day, you're like, I did nothing of meaning and import, right? Like, parents don't want their kids to live like that. And so if you point this out to parents, I think it can be quite powerful. Another thing to remind parents, especially, is that this is about this is also about your subjective sense of how much time you have, right? So parents will also be like, well, they're not that busy. But then you talk to the kids and they're like, no, I had soccer practice. Like they feel exhausted. And so kind of having them articulate what their own sense of time affluence is like can be important for parents. Because again, we're busier, we're kind of used to this busy cycle and it doesn't affect us as much. But having the kids articulate how time famished they're really feeling can be an eye opener for parents too. One thing, all of you will hopefully get the link to the podcast and also the online class. I often suggest that kids watch it with parents, because this is a domain I think is really educational. Because what will happen is I'll go through some of this content and parents will be like, oh, we always practice good sleep hygiene. It's like, no, I don't. Like as soon as you shut the door, I'm on my phone all the time. Or like, we're a really grateful family. It's like, no, you're not, mom. Like you complain, like, or, like what will happen is like, parents will see how much they're kind of not doing what they thought with some of these tips. And that can also just be educational too.
That makes a lot of sense. With the social nutritious connections, what does that look like right now? What can that look like right now? Some of us have been able, those of us who are active in youth ministry have been able to have some in-person interactions, outside, distanced. Others have not, virtual. How do we help? How do our groups name that for themselves? What is actually nutritious for them?
Yeah, I think part of it is this is why I use this term nutritious, right? Because I think the idea is like it can change, right? Like I'm on, like if I'm in like, I don't know, like bowl 7 of salad, it's not going to be nutritious anymore. Like it's going to start hurting my body, right? And I think that's kind of the way and sometimes you want some junk food if it's not too much, right? And so I think that's the way I like to think about social connection is, let the people you're working with articulate it for you. right? Like you might think that that in-person social connection is like the greatest thing, right? But it might be that for them, they have really COVID scared parents, and to get there, it's really tricky, and to squeeze it in, it's just too much, and it's really scary. Like maybe that doesn't feel nutritious for them. Maybe there's too much kind of baggage with it. Like, maybe getting together over Zoom is better in those cases. Maybe getting over together in Zoom is good for you, but it's awful for them because they were just like in school for like all day, right? Maybe for them, the lots of faces is great. Maybe for them, one-on-one is great. I think the thing to recognize is it's going to be different for different people, but also it's going to change. Like even for me, right? Like, I was in the beginning of the pandemic doing like Zoom spa nights with like family members and my college roommates and things, and that's great. But if I've had a day where I just had a bunch of Zoom meetings, like I do not at 7 p.m. want to do a Zoom spa night. I just want to like, either talk on the phone or like do something else, or right. Like you need to kind of pay attention to where you are. And I think that's why I like this terminology of nutritious. And that just might be a terminology to use with kids. Like they get it, right? Like just like what feels good for you and have them kind of articulate it. And also pay attention because I think they don't know, like, because what we're dragged to, what we crave doesn't necessarily feel good. Like we crave, like, pop on social media when we have that 5 minutes. We crave stuff that's not going to feel great because often the startup cost for the healthy stuff is higher, right? Like just with food, right? Like the startup cost of making like chopping the veggies and making a really nutritious salad is higher than just like going to McDonald's. But ultimately the reward is better. And so I think that might be another thing to articulate is like one thing you can do is help students with that startup cost, right? So that they, maybe the startup cost of setting up these Zoom meetings or setting up ties or giving them a schedule for it, like that can be a thing you do to kind of overcome that to make the social connection a little easier.
We had a follow-up question on that from the chat. Do these strategies work in equal measure with introverts and extroverts alike? Is there any science behind that?
Yeah, surprisingly there is. In fact, this is something that I get asked a lot for social connection. People be like, "That social connection is great for you extroverts, but for introverts, like, doesn't work as well." Turns out the scientists have looked at this, and this is another domain in which it seems like our misprediction might be leading us astray. The difference between introverts and extroverts, the data suggests, isn't the well-being boost you get out of connection; it's the difference in prediction. So both introverts and extroverts, if you have a really nutritious social connection, will feel good afterwards. The difference is that extroverts predict that it will feel good, whereas introverts think it's gonna like actively suck, basically, right? And so the difference between introverts and extroverts is introverts do seem to need to balance their alone time a little bit more, but the social time they do get is still good. And so it's kind of like the introverts are, the extroverts go to the party and is predicting the party is going to be great. The introverts don't go to the party because they think, the party is going to suck. But the problem is you don't ever update those predictions. And so I think if you're a kind of like self-reported introvert, try it a little more, like push it. Again, not like a huge party, but like a one-on-one call with a friend you haven't talked to, right? Like think about what has felt nutritious in the past. You won't think it's going to be as effective. That's what the data suggests, but just try it. And the research really shows it will be more effective than you think.
That's awesome. Thank you. We have 5 minutes left, so I'm going to ask you just one final question. There's a lot of information here, and it's all really good, and all 10 strategies sound really important. For those of us who feel utterly overwhelmed, who need to take, baby steps into this kind of work, what's the first step you would tell us to implement yesterday in order to improve happiness in our ministry with youth?
Yeah, I think there's two ways to answer that form of question. So one is, which of the 10 is most important? I get this from my Yale students a lot, right? Because they're so time famished. They're like, I don't get time for 10. Give me one. Give me the one that's, like the Cliff Notes, right? Totally get it. I think it depends on what you're doing, right? I read some of these and some of you were thinking, I'm super grateful. I meditate every day, I exercise, I'm good. But oof, a gratitude me, I'm not as great. Like you heard one that wasn't good for you. Intervene on that one, because even if you take a baby step there, like you're going to be better off. If you've never exercised before, if you do 10 jumping jacks, that's going to feel great to your body. If you're a terrible sleeper, implementing some sleep hygiene is probably going to help. So pick the one that feels the hardest and take a baby step there, and that's going to be great. But that gets to the second way to answer the question, which is this baby step idea. Sometimes when you hear these 10 in the middle of the pandemic, you're like, oh my gosh, this is even more that I have to do. Like you start kind of beating yourself up. And this gets to kind of maybe the most important idea that came out of this reign, right? Which is like, not to beat yourself up, to nurture, to be nutritious, right? Like you don't have to force yourself to go to a million parties. Like you need to ask yourself, baby step, what might feel nutritious, right? Like we are in the middle of a global pandemic. We should not be like forcing ourselves to like be, the best like self-care, self-help, patrons that we ever should be. And same for your students, right? Because I think they're also beating themselves up all the time. That's, the kind of accolade culture we've given them. Like convince them that it's a baby step. Like it can be 30 seconds of meditation. It can be following 3 breaths, right? It can be one jumping jack, right? Like the idea is that start really small and give yourself the permission to start small, because that's still a step in the right direction and it'll help you build a habit to do more later on.
That's really helpful. Thank you. Folks, we are at the end of our time today, and I see that we have one other question. I'm going to have some time with Dr. Santos later, and I have written that question down, so we'll get to that at another time, and you'll be able to access that clip at a later time. But thank you very much for attending today. Dr. Santos, thank you so much for your wisdom and for sharing from your expertise in this area. We're really grateful. Folks, feel free to keep an eye on our upcoming events and to mark off that date in December. That's Wednesday, December 2nd. And if there's anything else we can do to serve you, don't hesitate to drop us an email in this season. Blessings to you and your ministries.